Hello, dear viewers. Welcome back to the Grave of the Shadows. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to thank you for your continued support. If you enjoy this tale, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Now, let's dim the lights and dive into tonight's chilling account. We don't speak of the twins, my grandmother always said. I never understood why, not until now. The weight of those words had haunted me for years, lingering like a shadow just out of reach. It wasn't until I returned to her house, after her passing, that the true meaning of her warning began to unfold. Her house, or should I say, the family estate, always had a strange pull. Nestled deep in the Vermont woods, the old Victorian mansion was an enigma. Weathered and worn, the three-story house stood like a forgotten relic, wrapped in dense foliage that seemed to conceal as much as it revealed. The faint scent of lavender always hung in the air, a reminder of my grandmother's presence as I spent every summer there as a child. But there was one thing I never questioned: the room at the end of the hall. The room that was locked. Always. No one dared to enter, and when I asked about it, my grandmother's face would harden, her voice dropping to a whisper. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Yet, curiosity is a powerful thing. As a child, I pressed my ear to the heavy oak door during thunderstorms, convinced I could hear the faint sound of children's laughter from within. And so began my obsession with the locked room. The more I was told not to ask, the more I longed to know. Little did I know then, the secrets hidden behind that door would change my life forever. I was about to uncover a truth that would shake everything I thought I knew about my family, and the twins who were never meant to be spoken of. The journey back to my grandmother's house felt like a return to another life, a life I had long left behind. As I drove down the familiar winding dirt road, the dense forest around me seemed to close in, just as it had when I was a child. The canopy of trees formed a dark archway, their branches intertwined above the road, filtering the sunlight into a muted green glow. It was as if the world outside no longer existed, and I was being drawn into a place suspended in time. The house appeared before me, as imposing as I remembered, its weathered clapboards citing a reminder of its age, and the 3 stories of windows staring out like unblinking eyes. The gabled roof, now sagging with time, seemed to weigh heavily on the rest of the house, as though it too carried the weight of generations of secrets. The large Victorian mansion had always been an enigma, a fortress of memories that I never quite understood. I parked my car at the base of the long gravel driveway and stood for a moment, staring at the house. A faint breeze rustled the branches of the maple trees that lined the yard, but the house remained silent, as if holding its breath. The once lush gardens that surrounded the house were overgrown now, their flowers wilting, their pathways barely visible beneath the tall grass. My grandmother, who had tended to the gardens with such devotion, was no longer there to care for them. The absence of her presence made the house feel colder, emptier, as though it was merely a shell, waiting for the past to return. I walked slowly up the creaky wooden steps to the front door, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. The door, which had once been a warm welcome, now stood closed and uninviting. As I reached for the handle, memories of my childhood flooded back, summers spent running through the house, discovering hidden rooms, and playing in the gardens. But there was always one room that I was forbidden to enter, a room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway that was locked and untouched. I had never thought much of it as a child, but now, standing at the threshold of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it held the answers to the questions I had never dared to ask. I pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest. The smell of dust and aged wood hit me immediately, mingling with the faint scent of lavender that I remembered from my grandmother's perfume. The house felt smaller now, its grandeur diminished by the years of neglect. The once grand foyer, with its towering staircase and intricate moldings, now seemed cramped and dim. The chandeliers, which had once glittered with light, were now dull and coated with layers of dust. It was as if the house itself had aged in her absence. I wandered through the familiar rooms, my fingers trailing along the surfaces of antique furniture and faded photographs that hung on the walls. The rooms were filled with remnants of the past, a life that had been lived and now only existed in memories. The soft ticking of an old grandfather clock echoed through the hallways, its rhythm both comforting and unnerving. It was as if the house was trying to remind me of its past, to bring back the memories I had buried for so long. I made my way to the library, where I had spent countless hours as a child, lost in books and stories. The room was just as I remembered it, with its dark oak bookshelves lining the walls and the large leather armchair by the window. But there was something different now, something missing. The warmth and liveliness that had once filled this room were gone. The room felt cold, empty, and silent. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a sound behind me. I turned to find my mother standing in the doorway, holding a thick envelope in her hands. Her face, usually so composed, was etched with worry, her eyes betraying a hint of sadness. She held out the envelope to me, her hands trembling slightly. "This is for you," she said softly. "It's from your grandmother." I took the envelope from her, the wax seal bearing the intricate design of intertwining roses, my grandmother's signature mark. The weight of it felt heavier than just paper and ink. Inside, there was a key, old and brass, along with a letter written in my grandmother's precise handwriting. "My dearest Eliza," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I have passed from this world. The house is yours now, along with all its secrets. I have carried this burden for too long, and I cannot take it with me to my grave. The key enclosed will open the locked room on the 3rd floor. What you find there may disturb you, but I believe you deserve to know the truth about our family." I read the letter 3 times, my hands trembling as I took in the words. The key in my palm felt unnaturally cold, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. My mother stood behind me, her face pale and unreadable. "What does it say?" she asked softly. I hesitated before slipping the letter into my pocket. "Nothing important," I lied. "Just some instructions about the house." But I knew that this was no ordinary letter. This was the beginning of something far darker, something that had been waiting for me to discover. It had been years since I last visited my grandmother's house, yet everything about it felt familiar, and yet entirely different. The air in the house felt thick with unspoken history, each room brimming with memories, but also with unanswered questions. The key in my pocket felt heavier with each passing hour, as if it carried the weight of all the secrets it was meant to unlock. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. The strange things that happened in the house when I was younger seemed distant now, like the fading echoes of a forgotten dream. But as I wandered through the rooms, memories began to resurface. I could hear my grandmother's soft footsteps echoing through the hallways, her voice humming softly as she went about her daily routines. She had been a woman of routine, of order, and her presence had always brought a sense of calm to the house. But now, there was only silence. The house had changed since her passing, and with it, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was out of place. I found myself drawn back to the 3rd floor hallway, where the locked room had always been. It was as if the house was calling me back to that door, urging me to open it and confront whatever had been hidden there for so long. I had never truly understood why my grandmother had kept the room locked. There was something in her eyes whenever I asked about it, something that made me think that she wasn't just protecting a physical space but was trying to keep something contained. The door had always seemed like a boundary, an invisible line that I was never meant to cross. But now, as I stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the 3rd floor, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to know what was behind that door. I had always wondered what was inside, but now, the curiosity felt like a fire inside me, burning hotter the longer I waited. My mother, too, seemed different. There was a distance between us, a wall of silence that had grown thicker with the years. She avoided certain topics, especially when it came to the twins. I had never understood why my family was so secretive about them, but I knew that whatever had happened in the past had left scars that were still fresh, even if no one would speak of them. I decided to confront my mother. We had spent most of the afternoon together, silently wandering through the house, but as the evening drew closer, I felt a pressing need to ask her about the room, about the twins, about everything. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I approached her, her face hidden behind a mug of tea. "Mom," I began hesitantly, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened to the twins?" Her gaze shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. She set the mug down with a soft clink and looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "We don't speak of them," she replied in a tone that brooked no argument. "But why? Why is it such a big secret?" I pressed, unable to hold back the questions any longer. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sharp noise. "Because some things are better left buried," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't need to know, Eliza. Not now. Not ever." I felt a chill crawl up my spine as her words settled into the air. There was something in her tone, a finality, that made me feel like I had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. But the more she tried to push me away, the more determined I became to uncover the truth. The house was full of secrets, and I had come back to find them all. Later that evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself standing in front of the door again. The silence in the house had grown even more pronounced, as if the very walls were holding their breath. I could feel the weight of the key in my pocket, and my hand trembled slightly as I reached for it. My heart raced in my chest as I stood before the locked door, the one that had haunted my childhood dreams. It was time to face the truth. I inserted the key into the lock, feeling the cold metal against my fingers. The door creaked open with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the air thick and stale. I stepped inside cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the narrow window at the far end of the room. What I saw inside was both familiar and unsettling. The room was frozen in time, preserved as it had been decades ago. The cribs, covered in dust and cobwebs, stood side by side, as if waiting for children who would never return. The rocking chair in the corner, once a place of comfort and warmth, now seemed cold and empty. The room held the remnants of a life that had never been fully lived. But there was something more, something that made my skin crawl. The air in the room felt heavy, as if it held a memory of things better left forgotten. I felt the presence of something that had been waiting for me, watching me. And as I stepped further into the room, I realized that I wasn't alone. As I stood in the room, staring at the dusty cribs and the forgotten toys, a wave of emotion washed over me. The air was thick with the weight of untold stories, the silence almost oppressive. My grandmother's house had always felt like a place out of time, a place where the past lingered in every corner. But here, in this room, I felt as if I had stepped into something much darker, a part of the family's history that had been hidden for generations. The mystery of the twins had always loomed over our family, a cloud that no one dared to approach. But now, standing in the midst of the preserved nursery, I felt as though I had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The room, though undisturbed by time, had an eerie quality to it. The cribs, though untouched, seemed to hold the ghosts of children who had never truly lived. The toys, once meant for play, were now just silent witnesses to a tragedy that had never been spoken of. My hand trembled as I reached for the photograph that lay on the dresser between the cribs. Wiping away the dust, I stared at the image, my grandmother, much younger, holding two infants wrapped in identical blankets. She was smiling in the photograph, but even in the faded image, I could see the strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She looked happy, yes, But there was something beneath the surface, something that made the smile seem forced, hollow even. The twins, Theodore and Theodora. Their names were embroidered on the quilts in the cribs, but there was nothing else in the room that could tell me who they really were. I had seen photographs of them as babies in the old albums, but they had always been a mystery, a subject no one dared to touch. My grandmother's refusal to speak of them, her silence, had only deepened my curiosity. Now, standing in their nursery, I was more determined than ever to uncover the truth about these children who had been lost to history. I moved to the nightstand beside the rocking chair, where a small leather-bound journal sat, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling as I turned them. The first entry was dated June 15, 1952. Today I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The labor was difficult and at times I feared I would not survive it. But they are here now and they are perfect. Theodore and Theodora, my beautiful children. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, though the tremor in her penmanship suggested that something was wrong, even from the very beginning. The next few pages chronicled the early days of their lives. They cried constantly, my grandmother wrote, but it wasn't like normal crying. It was more like screaming, a high-pitched wail that seemed to go on for hours. The doctors insisted it was just colic, a temporary phase, but my grandmother's words revealed her growing fear. There was something in their eyes, something she couldn't quite explain, something that made her skin crawl. They stare at me, she wrote, following me with their eyes as I move around the nursery. They don't sleep when they should. They lie awake, watching, always watching. As I read, a cold chill ran down my spine. The twins had never been ordinary children. There was something fundamentally wrong with them, something beyond their years. I turned the page, and the entries became more disturbing. My grandmother described how the twins began to develop at an alarming rate, sitting up and speaking their first words at just 3 months old. At this point, the house began to change, too. Pets and small animals around the house began to disappear, only to be found later, mutilated, near the nursery. My grandmother's words became increasingly frantic as she described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dead of night, shadows that seemed to move against the light. The twins were at the center of it all, always watching, always silent. The most chilling entry came on September 3, 1952. I caught Theodora standing over Theodore's crib last night, pressing a pillow over his face. When I screamed, she turned to look at me with such hatred in her eyes. She's only 3 months old. It's impossible. And yet, the entry trailed off, as though my grandmother couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. I read it again, my heart pounding in my chest. This was no longer a story about 2 babies growing up. This was a story of something far darker, something evil that had taken root in the hearts of these children. I turned the pages, each one more frantic than the last, until I came to the final entry, dated December 24, 1952. Harold is dead. They killed him. I know they did, though the police are calling it an accident. He fell down the stairs. They say he broke his neck. But I heard them giggling afterward. I heard them say, "One down." My hands shook as I put the journal down, unable to continue. The death of my grandfather, a man who had been so devoted to my grandmother, was not an accident. The twins had killed him. But why? What had happened to them? What had they become? And why had my grandmother kept all of this a secret for so long? She had preserved the room exactly as it had been, leaving the cribs and toys untouched, the only remnants of the children who had never truly been allowed to live. As I stood there, the weight of the journal's revelations pressing down on me, I realized that my grandmother had carried the burden of this dark secret for years. And now, it was my turn to uncover the truth. I had opened the door to the past, and I couldn't turn back now. The more I uncovered, the more the house seemed to close in around me. What I had once thought of as a comforting place, filled with memories of childhood summers, had transformed into something far more sinister. Each creaking floorboard, each gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to carry the weight of the family's dark secrets. The house was no longer just a building, it had become a living, breathing entity, haunted by the past and the remnants of what had once been. As I sifted through the journal entries, my mind raced with thoughts of the twins. Theodore and Theodora had not just been abnormal children, they were something much worse. They were vessels for something darker, something ancient. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "They are not human. Not like the rest of us." What had she meant by that? And how had they come to be this way? I couldn't stop myself from asking more questions, even if I knew they might bring more horror than I could handle. It wasn't just the journal that had disturbed me. Strange things began happening around the house. Objects that I knew I had placed in one room would turn up in another, as though they had been moved by unseen hands. The rocking chair in the nursery would rock by itself, creaking softly, as if someone were sitting in it, even though I was certain no one had been there. And at night, I could hear the faint sound of laughter, soft, high-pitched, and haunting. The kind of laughter that no child should make. I spent the next few days walking through the house, my mind consumed by the fear that something was watching me. The more I explored, the more I felt as though I was being led into a trap that had been set for generations. The house seemed to resist me at every turn, as if it was trying to keep me from the truth. The walls felt closer now, the air heavier, and the temperature colder. It was as if something was pushing against me, urging me to leave, to walk away from whatever dark path I was about to tread. But I couldn't. The more I uncovered, the more I was drawn to the truth, no matter how terrible it was. I had already opened the door to this nightmare, and there was no turning back now. On the third night after discovering the journals, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I lay still in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just outside my door. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by the unsettling discoveries I had made, but the footsteps continued. They were getting closer. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the hardwood floor. I crept toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed felt even worse. I opened the door just a crack, peering into the dark hallway. And there, at the far end, stood a figure. A child, standing perfectly still, staring at me with hollow eyes. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. Then, the laughter came. It was high-pitched and eerie, echoing through the house, bouncing off the walls like 1,000 voices at once. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing in my chest. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. The laughter continued, growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a child's laughter anymore, it was something else, something ancient, something malevolent. I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in on me. The walls seemed to close in, and the house itself felt like it was alive, its very foundations shifting, groaning in protest. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. But something inside me, something darker, told me that leaving would not end it. The house, and whatever was trapped within it, would follow me. It had been waiting for years, and now it was closer than ever. I needed answers, but I was no longer sure I could handle the truth. The house was not just haunted by ghosts, it was cursed, bound by something far older, something that had been tied to my family for generations. The twins were not just children. They were something much worse. And whatever had been set in motion all those years ago was coming to a head. I had opened the door to the past, but now, I realized, The past was about to open the door to me. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to carry a sense of foreboding. The once familiar walls now felt like they were closing in on me, pressing down with the weight of my family's dark history. I had come so far, and yet, as I stood at the foot of the stairs leading to the third floor, I felt the overwhelming sense that I was about to cross a point of no return. The key in my pocket felt cold against my skin. I could hear the faint whispers in the house, eerie, unintelligible words that seemed to come from nowhere. The house was alive with a presence, a malevolent force that had been waiting for me. The laughter of the twins echoed in my mind, as if it were coming from the very walls, from the very air around me. I knew that what I was about to uncover would change everything. But part of me, the part that had always been curious, always wanted to know the truth, knew that there was no turning back now. I took a deep breath and ascended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway at the top was darker than I remembered, the shadows more pronounced. The air seemed colder, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved cautiously, the sound of my footsteps almost deafening in the silence. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it, the door to the locked room, the one I had been forbidden to enter for as long as I could remember. It stood before me, unchanged, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. The brass key in my hand trembled as I approached the door. The heavy oak was still there, the same door that had haunted my childhood, the door that held the answers to questions I had never dared to ask. I inserted the key into the lock, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. The room was bathed in silver moonlight, and at first glance, it seemed ordinary, a nursery, preserved as if frozen in time. But as I stepped inside, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of memories, with the weight of the past. The cribs stood side by side against the far wall, their white paint yellowed with age. The rocking chair in the corner, once a place of comfort, now sat still, like a forgotten relic of a time long past. The room was a graveyard of memories, each object frozen in place as if it were waiting for something that would never come. I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the shelves where toys, wooden blocks, dolls, tin soldiers, were neatly arranged, untouched by time. The faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air, but there was something else now, a sharp, metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I moved to the dresser between the cribs and found the photograph. It was the same one I had seen earlier, my grandmother holding the twins in her arms, smiling in a way that seemed forced. But something in her eyes, something behind her smile, told a different story. The tension in her shoulders, the strain around her eyes, was unmistakable. She had known, even then, that something was wrong. I set the photograph down and turned my attention to the cribs. They were empty, but the blankets, embroidered with the names Theodore and Theodora, were neatly folded. As I ran my fingers over the stitching, I felt a strange connection to these children I had never known. They were my family, yet they felt like strangers, like ghosts who had never truly been allowed to live. It was then that I noticed the journal, resting on the nightstand beside the rocking chair. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it to the first entry, dated June 15, 1952. Today I gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The labor was difficult, and at times I feared I would not survive it. But they are here now and they are perfect. Theodore and Theodora, my beautiful children. My grandmother's handwriting was shaky, a reflection of the fear and uncertainty she must have felt. As I turned the pages, the entries became more disturbing. The twins had cried constantly, but not like normal babies. They screamed, their cries unlike anything my grandmother had ever heard. The doctors had dismissed it as colic, but my grandmother knew better. There was something wrong with them. She had seen it in their eyes. They didn't look like normal children. They looked different. The journal went on to describe how the twins had developed at an alarming rate, speaking their first words at just 3 months old. They whispered to each other in a language that no one else could understand. And then the pets began to disappear. The animals in the house were found dead, mutilated, and the twins were always nearby. My grandmother's fear grew with each passing day, but she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone the truth. She had hoped it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. I read the final entry, dated December 24, 1952, Harold is dead. They killed him. I know they did, though the police are calling it an accident. He fell down the stairs. They say he broke his neck. But I heard them giggling afterward. I heard them say, "One down." The journal dropped from my hands, the weight of my grandmother's words crashing down on me. The twins had killed my grandfather. They hadn't been children at all. They had been something far worse, something beyond human understanding. And now, standing in this room, I realized that whatever had been unleashed all those years ago had never truly been contained. It was still here, still waiting. The air in the house had grown colder. It wasn't the natural chill of an old building, nor the kind of cold that comes with winter nights. It was something else. A palpable sense of dread had seeped into the very walls, and the once comforting creaks and groans of the house now felt like whispers, like the house itself was trying to tell me something. The twins were no longer just a story. They had been brought back to life in the most terrifying way. I had uncovered the truth, a truth I wasn't sure I could handle. But now, I knew that I couldn't stop. The house was a time bomb, and I had to act before it exploded. I had to perform the ritual. The grimoire, the key to breaking the curse, had to be used, even though I had no idea what I was truly dealing with. But the fear in my grandmother's handwriting, the terror that had gripped her, was a warning. This wasn't just about confronting ghosts or memories. This was something ancient. Something evil. And it was waiting for me. The ritual required blood. My grandmother's blood had been used to bind the entity, but she was gone now. According to the grimoire, the ritual could only be completed by a direct descendant of the twins, someone who carried the same bloodline. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My mother was the only living direct descendant of the twins. But I couldn't bring myself to ask her for help. She had always been distant, protective of the family secret. She had always known, deep down, that something wasn't right with the twins, but she never spoke of it. She had buried that part of our family's history, just as I had buried my childhood memories of the mansion. I had come this far on my own. I had to finish what my grandmother had started, even if it meant risking everything. I went to the attic that night, the place where the binding ritual had been initiated. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I ascended the narrow staircase. The temperature in the house had dropped drastically, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. The lantern flickered as I entered the attic, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the wooden beams. A familiar figure stood there, Aunt Catherine. She had always been an enigmatic presence in my life, someone who seemed to understand the things my grandmother had left unsaid. I had called her earlier, telling her I needed help. She had agreed, though I could see the unease in her eyes. She had spent her life avoiding the family's dark history. But now, she stood by my side, ready to help me break the cycle. "You know what must be done," she said, her voice calm, but there was a tremor in it, a hint of fear that I hadn't heard before. I nodded. "It has to end tonight. If we don't do this, whatever is trapped in that room will be free. The house, the curse, it will all break free." We set to work, preparing the ritual as instructed in the grimoire. Catherine mixed herbs and minerals in a mortar, chanting softly under her breath as she did. The air seemed to grow heavier with each word she spoke. I drew the symbols on the floor with chalk, feeling the weight of their power as the lines connected. Each stroke felt like a binding, tying us to something ancient. My hands trembled as I completed the circle. Catherine began the incantation, her voice growing stronger with each word. I stood in the center of the circle, holding the silver knife that had been passed down through generations. My heart was racing, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. I pressed the knife to my palm, feeling the sharp sting as blood welled up. I let it drip onto the floor, the red liquid mixing with the chalk and the symbols. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and a low hum filled the air, as though something was waking up. The rocking chairs in the nursery began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster, their creaks echoing through the house. Shadows danced around us, moving in unnatural ways. The air was thick with an ancient power, and I could feel it closing in, pushing against me, testing my resolve. "Finish it," Catherine urged, her voice strained. She was weakening, too. The power of the ritual was taking its toll on both of us. I closed my eyes and whispered the final words of the incantation, "With blood of the line, I bind thee. With salt and iron, by silver and ash, I command thee to remain within these bounds until the appointed time." The room shook with an explosion of energy. The symbols on the floor glowed with a fierce, pulsating light, casting shadows that seemed to move against the walls. The twins' laughter echoed in my ears, but it was no longer playful. It was filled with rage and hatred, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the house. And then, suddenly, it was over. The light dimmed, the air cleared, and the house fell silent. The rocking chairs stopped moving. The oppressive weight in the room lifted. But as I opened my eyes, I realized that the fight wasn't over. The binding was temporary, just as the grimoire had warned. It would need to be renewed. I stood up, my legs shaking, and looked at Catherine. "It's done," I said, though I knew the battle had only just begun. The twins, or whatever had been masquerading as them, were contained for now, but they would return. They always did. "We've bought ourselves some time," Catherine replied, her voice tired but resolute. "But we need to keep the ritual alive. The house, it's still here. And so are they." I looked around the room, taking in the faded walls and dusty corners. The house had changed, but it would never be the same. The curse had been broken, but the legacy would live on. As long as the house stood, the twins would always be watching, waiting for the cycle to begin again. The house had fallen silent. The echoes of the ritual still lingered in the air, but the oppressive weight that had haunted me for days was finally gone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. The twins, or whatever dark presence they had been, were contained once again, trapped within the house, bound by the ancient ritual. But I knew that this peace was fragile. The curse would always be there, waiting for its next opportunity. As I stood in the center of the room, my mind raced with everything I had uncovered. My grandmother's secrets, the horrors of the past, and the truth about the twins, it had all been too much to take in. But now, standing in the aftermath of the ritual, I understood. This house was never just a home. It was a prison, a holding cell for a family's darkest sins. And the curse, the evil that had lived here for so long, was never truly gone. It was simply lying in wait, hidden beneath layers of time and memory. I walked through the house once more, the weight of everything finally sinking in. Each room held a memory, a piece of the past that had been buried under years of silence. But now, I could see the house for what it truly was, a reflection of my family's broken legacy. The nursery, once a place of innocence, was now a tomb for the twins who had never been allowed to live, their souls trapped between two worlds. My grandmother's actions had been desperate, but they had been a last attempt to protect us from the horrors that lay within her bloodline. I couldn't help but wonder if there was any escape. Could I leave the house, walk away from the curse, and live a life free of its grasp? Or would it always follow me, a shadow in my wake, whispering its secrets, pulling me back to the place where it all began? As the final light of day filtered through the curtains, I realized that I would never truly escape. The house would always be with me. The memories, the ghosts, and the curse, they were all part of me now. But I had one thing my grandmother never had, the truth. And with it, the power to stop the cycle. For now, at least.